Without further ado, let's start by introducing the initiative itself, the Salvo project. Now, we're dealing with asset management. Assets of pretty much any nature, whatever an organization owns or has value in, and the decision-making about how to manage those assets. Now, if you look at the life cycle of assets, there is a phase called, do I need one in the first place? And gosh, that's scary, that costs money. And so decisions in the environment of procurement and development construction have particular flavors. In other words, you're about to spend a lump of money, quite often a very big lump of money, but you're making that decision based on extremely uncertain assumptions. They're all projections about potential demand in the future, the characteristics of what is being designed or proposed. There are risks and uncertainties in every possible direction. But the criticality of the decision is not just because we're about to spend a lot of money up front. The implications of your decisions and your designs you have to live with. And around 80% of total life cycle cost is pre-engineered at the drawing board. Becomes non-negotiable thereafter. You can only change things to a certain limited degree during its life in adaptions and how you look after it and how you use things. So the front-end loading of asset management decisions is super critical, but also super vulnerable. And the decision disciplines have to take that into account. During the management of assets and their lives, there is I'll call it a healthy tension, sometimes an unhealthy tension, between the asset users and the asset carers. People are spending money and resources on keeping the asset healthy, and those that are trying to exploit it, make use of it, extract value from the assets. And this doesn't matter whether it's a service function or a production function. There's some asset benefit and some asset care implications. The tension exists, of course, insofar as when we use assets, we can degrade them and have implications for looking after them. When we look after them, we quite often need access to look after them at the expense of their availability for usage. Hence the tension. That gets more complex when we add the time dimension into it because of the lag. Doing the wrong thing now, you might have to suffer later. But whose accountability does that fall to? Saving today's cash and paying for it later might be somebody else's cash. So we have boundaries and we have silos and we've got all sorts of problems of what is the right combination to deal with. That includes things like sustainability and the asset's residual life being affected by these decisions during its life. When we can no longer confidently say that we're in a steady state of asset utilization or asset care, we have the scary stuff called having to face the need for capital reinvestment again. That may be the problems of renewal, degradation that is not recoverable by maintenance, in which case we're talking about buying a new one. It could be not that the asset itself is degrading, but that the world has moved on and technology has rendered our current capability as obsolete, no longer supported, supply chain drying up, spare parts and skills, in which case we're talking about renewal for the purposes of keeping up and or improving. And it may be a changing demand, changing functional roles. So it may be an external definition of current asset is old by virtue of what is now needed. Demand profiles are changing very rapidly in certain industries, and keeping up with that demand in terms of reinvestment, extensions of life, upgrades, represents big ticket decisions again. But at least this stage we've got good knowledge of what we've already got because we've had a long period to learn about it. We may not have been particularly good at recording that, and our data systems may not be that which we had hoped, but nevertheless, we at least have experience to draw on about option A, called staying with what you've got. Option B, called do something different instead, we're back in the realm of speculation and assumptions and probing in the dark in terms of the contentions and options that are put on the table. If we look at the decision-making ranges that we're now facing, we've got a bit of a perfect storm. I'm not going to talk numbers. You're going to hear those from the other presentations this evening, but it is pretty scary. We have a very significant aged asset base, not just in the UK, but this is an international challenge. A lot of infrastructure was built in a relatively similar post-industrial world, post-industrial revolution period, early in the last century, beginning of this one, starting to get to the point where renewal and things are coming back on the agenda. We have escalating demand for services, both in terms of volume, changed distribution of demographics and market sectors, and significantly escalating expectations on service provision and standards. We also have increasing accountabilities, increasing need to be transparent about our governance and our justifications of what we spend and why. And it's not just the legislation and the regulatory interests, it's also those that are providing funding, wanting credibility as to why they should be spending what, and obviously the beneficiaries and the public have a significantly more informed interest in not just what is going to be done, but also the why and the when. The rates of change in technology turnover are still accelerating, and it's not limited just to the high-tech end of telecommunications and electronics. This is right the way through the material sciences worlds, technical process engineering stuff. We have very fast rates of improvement now, rendering our assumptions about asset lives being extremely shaky. What was designed for a 20-year life is quite often overtaken within 5 or 10. Not because of degradation reasons, but by virtue of what you could otherwise do now. Clearly, the financial concerns over the last few years have impinged extremely heavily in terms of the reinvestment, decision-making options. And one of the things we've addressed in Salvo is not just the business case for what to do, it's also what is the least worst thing of stuff that you can no longer do because you can't afford it. What's the bottom of the pecking order in the capital programs and so on? If you can't afford to do everything, which stuff gets deferred? Which stuff gets cancelled? How can we demonstrate that is the least worst consequence of a constrained resource? And it's not necessarily cash, it can be skills and other forms of limited resourcing. A further area that shaped the definition of what the Salvo project needed to address was knowledge capture. Most sectors now, we are very vulnerable to the aging asset, the silver surfers approaching retirement with all the pragmatic experience and knowledge walking out the door. We then have a significantly shrunken part of the workforce just in the stage of learning all that practical stuff. And then we have a significant younger group coming in postgraduate, lots of book learning, lots of theory stuff, but haven't yet stabilized it into operational realities and self-confidence. So capturing tacit knowledge in a structured way, in an auditable way, was a key part of what we've set out in this Salvo process. There's no shortage of clever stuff out there. There are 3-letter acronyms coming out of our ears. And I could probably refresh this slide on a weekly basis with a bunch of new ones. Many organizations are experimenting and selectively using these things to great effect. Quite a lot of people have burnt their fingers by thinking they're going to be a panacea solution, try to implement them on everything, and of course they've then come across their limitations and their selective applicabilities. And a good asset manager takes on a toolbox approach that says these techniques to these limits of usage in these combinations. However, one gap in all of them, and I have to say this as without exception because we've yet to find any technique that does this properly, is the determination of not just what to do, that's a technical solution, but how much of it to do and when in business language. How do we turn what is quite often a diagnostic of a problem, an operational weakness, an asset health issue, a geographical dimension to problem boundaries, a diagnostic drill down root cause clarification of the nature of the beast? How do we move it to the so what stage? Therefore, what do we need to do and when? And into a form that will convince somebody to write out a check to do it. That is a systemic weakness in the existing methodologies in the asset management arena. So, the Salvo project. 3 years ago, we wrote down a remit specifically focused on a very common problem. How do we determine what to do, and how do we prove it to be the best way of managing aging assets. That means understanding degradation, renewal, refurbishment, obsolescence, and changing asset care implications. It's a cross-sector group. You'll see that in a second. It's a cross-cultural one. And the objective is to write down what do we need to do in a form that is traceable and followable as a guideline process. The guideline of interpretation and application in different circumstances. We have commissioned and developed a number of analytical tools to reinforce that discipline and allow us to ask what-if type questions in an economic implication sense. And we've built a portfolio of worked examples so that organizations can take that as an example, stimulate the ideas to see what applications that might be across their personal examples and circumstances. The participants in the project have ranged from manufacturing and transport and utilities, from process industries, from batch operations, from service providers, from academics, from IT information system providers. Deliberately a polyglot of circumstances, private, public, regulated, unregulated, and in different countries. Not proud, we're quite happy to learn from anywhere. What we're trying to do is collate what is generically applicable in all circumstances and take ideas from wherever we can find them. Core team of sponsors comprise the steering committee and then broader group associated with field trials, peer review, the interfacing type discussions and data sources and so on. What we've generated? Well, we can summarize it really in a very simple 6-step, what we call the smiley diagram. It's smiley, mainly because it puts a smile on your face. Now, much more importantly, it has a top-down part to it associated with zooming in on the stuff that matters, and a bottom-up to it in determining what needs to be done as a result, and its aggregation into a total program view. Step 1, where are the headaches? How big are they? What's worth investigating in the first place? In among the noise of everybody's got 1,000,001 things we could do, which is the one that's going to add the value to the greatest degree? Now, there's a lot of work that's gone on in this area in risk ranking and criticality analysis and so on. And we've filtered that for what are the must-do steps in scoping problem boundaries, in grouping assets that are worthy of a shared management strategy. And it's not just because they're of a type X design, they're a centrifugal pump, not a reciprocating pump. Because pumps in different functional roles will have different needs and different criticalities and different vulnerabilities, different age profiles, different health conditions, different usages. So it's the different dimensions of importance, but it's not just importance. What we've found in Salvo and developed the guidance for is how do we take 2 dimensions of how scary is something and how imminent is it. And the combination of those 2 allow us to focus on things that have the biggest prize and the most immediate opportunity for improvement. Timing dimension and scale of gain dimension. The double dimension allows us to demonstrate that we're seeking the most valuable, most urgent improvement opportunities, constantly. Having identified those circumstances, asking the key word, why, in a more institutionalized sense. Most organizations have root cause analysis and toolboxes associated with investigation. How do we target those? To what degree? It's not just understanding the causes of the problem we're trying to address. It's if we solve this, what other problems will go away? It's the relatedness of the underlying systemic problems. So we solve them once and have the multiple benefits of it. This is a fascinating outcome of the Salvo program. Step 3 is forcing lateral thinking. Having got our head around the true nature of the beast, what can be done about it? A lot of asset managers come from a technical background right now. This is a mistake in my view. We need a much more diverse source of skill sets to become good asset managers. Because at the moment, people are presuming predominantly technical solutions to technical problems. Whereas we've found that a vast number of the right solutions are in the non-asset area. The non-asset areas are things like changing your usage plans, changing your competency program, your recruitment program, taking out insurance instead of doing something to the assets. So step 3 broadens the discussion significantly in terms of optioneering. Whatever options are worth exploring, we have to decide whether they actually represent value for money. We've done a lot of work in step 4, which is the cost-benefit appraisal skills and the disciplines associated with asking the right questions, putting numbers to things. That includes risks and intangibles, how to quantify those, and how to determine if it's worth going down path A or path B, and if it's worth going down path A, how far is it worth going down path A? How close to the edge of the cliff to worth going? When should you replace? How many times should you inspect before you repair? When should you change from repairing something to replacing it? Or is it worth investing in contingency planning instead? This is the cost-benefit equation. But that's for discrete things to do. Discrete things to do, there's a diverse range of techniques needed for different type of proposals. As we start to look at the aggregation stage, coming up the smiley, these things are worthwhile. How would we coordinate them? What is the best way of blending them together to give our total program value for money? It could be that we change the way in which we operate things, and we change the way in which we look after them, and this is the point where we get rid of them instead. That would be a blending exercise. There's a bundling version of that, which is we've got to do lots of stuff, but we have limited resources, and we don't want to shut everything down to do things on every other day. What's the best way of grouping things for remote site visits or shutdown planning or outages, where you're delaying some stuff deliberately at a quantified risk to share excess advantages or overheads with other work that needs to be done? In other words, the optimal programming of the delivery. And that is needed before we can genuinely state with confidence, totally transparently, this is the optimal program of expenditure and the optimal risks that we should take and the optimal program of resource support, and demonstrate that to the outside world and why. Because at every single element, you can demonstrate why it's contributing and why not more and why not less and why not alternative things. So top down, drill down to the specific things that are worth considering and are they worth it and when, and the bottom-up aggregation of the things that are worth doing at the right times and in the right combinations to underpin the organization's required resource plans, financing plans, and performance forecasts. It doesn't mean you go through the whole smiley every time. For a first principle development of an organization's strategic asset management plan, it is looking at all possible headaches to zoom in on the ones that drive your priorities for investment. That's a first principle asset review, asset health reviews, asset criticality studies. Where are my headaches before trying to solve them? But if you've got a discrete headache that pops up, and let's face it, we do encounter some of those, where do we start? Well, straight in at step 2, because you've pre-qualified, you've got a headache. Now you understand why is it a headache, what is the nature of the illness, and what medicines are viable for us to consider, and so on. There's another whole tranche of circumstances called we're already doing stuff. We have a capital program, we are doing maintenance, we're doing inspections, we're doing all sorts of things. So the initiative may be which of those are indeed worth doing, or if we're now facing restricted resources or funding, which of those things should survive the cut and which ones can we afford not to do or to do less or to defer. In which case one's joining in at the appraisal of the actions stage, either as a one-off or a systematic review of them. So at each stage in the Salvo process, there are discrete instance examples, and there is what we're calling the batch version of the same thing, systematic view. Outputs. The Salvo methodology, and I'm going to be very strong about this point, Salvo is predominantly a method of approach in a disciplined way. The audit trail for tasks that are worth doing, the handshake is now to make sure they get done. So the output of this is the task, its best timing, and its justification. That's straight into the work planning mechanisms, with carrying with it the rationale as to why it's important and what would happen if you delayed it. So for work programming, work execution programming, you've got the ability to prioritize stuff that is timing critical and timing more flexible. That is also true of the bundled and work clustered activities where you're dealing with things like strategic shutdown plans, which is interfacing with marketing programs, multiple site coordinations, political permissions processes, and so on. We have here the rationale for what is worth doing together and when, and the economic justification for why it should occur then and not at another time, and the work programming for supply chain, contracting to execute it. It's the starting position. Of course, top prize is the total program of budgeting, resource planning, and risk management. This is the corporate implications and audience, as indeed the increasing standards and expectations on asset management, like the new ISO 55000 stuff, where you need to demonstrate you have an optimized overall strategic plan for the organization. It's funding that, providing the evidence to underpin that. I mentioned the diversity of thinking. Most organizations think in terms of what can we do to extend the life, or when should we replace, reset the clock, whatever. What we found in Salvo is that the menu is a lot longer, and we should be thinking about more lateral thinking solutions to manage our asset headaches. And only a proportion of those are asset interventions of a technical nature. The non-asset solutions exist in the design stage, in the utilization stage, in the asset care environment, modifications environment. These are not asset interventions. These are things that we can do, such as take out insurance or outsource or change the way in which we do contingency planning and so on. Forcing lateral thinking, very important part. Each of the decision types, each of the methods in Salvo has been turned into a storyboard to help people be more consistent and comprehensive in considering the various competing factors on that decision. So for example, this is a storyboard that's capturing a problem of an asset that requires a potential replacement. It's constructing a base case set of assumptions and building a picture over time of the current asset's characteristics and then what might be different about a proposed alternative. One can build that picture, and depending on what's been switched on or switched off in terms of the options you're about to appraise, the menu you've just looked at, which questions are asked is only the ones that are relevant to that particular scenario. But it's not just to build the picture and evaluate what to do, it's also making sure we close out decision making. A lot of organizations struggle with the turning it into action stage. And what we've developed within Salvo is the way in which we make sure the right decision is made by the right people and signed on to by the participants, but it gets to the point where we can hand it on to the execution stage and trace its implications. Close it out. This is actually thanks to a previous piece of work in this area back in the late 90s to make sure we look at all the business stakeholders, and we're looking at the combined effect of regulatory constraints, safety motives, reliability influences, sustainability influences, capital investment and operating cost influences, performance expectations and implications, the quality dimension, the impression and image attributes of customer satisfaction and reputation, environmental responsibilities, and so on. All of these are involved in asset management decision making, but to different degrees. Trying to find the sweet spot that keeps everybody happy to the right degree is a very complex juggling act. Finding that best blend of costs and risks and short-term and long-term, putting numbers to this picture, is one of the agenda items in Salvo, particularly step 4, and to do it when you have uncertain information in many of the dimensions. So part of the process is psychology, and a lot of Salvo is oriented towards the people factors. Structured interview techniques, tacit knowledge elicitation is the posh name for it, asking the right questions in the right way. For example, what we call the Sherlock Holmes method says you don't ask somebody, even if they're an expert, you don't say, what is the chance of this thing falling over? Because that's suggesting that you're expecting a number to come back. And they're going to be very nervous about, firstly, sharing their knowledge, secondly, committing to a number. Because they might be held accountable for the error in that number. You ask what it isn't. And you find the boundary conditions, the limits of credibility. It cannot be worse than that, cannot be better than that. the boundary conditions of optimism and pessimism. And if you follow the process and we've developed the team-based approach, there will be a collective agreement that it cannot be worse than this. Collective agreement that it cannot be better than that. That envelope encompasses everybody's perceptions of where the truth must lie. And that can be used directly, straight into the business case justification, and search for the point where a decision is least vulnerable to that uncertainty. In fact, it goes one step further. The process actually calculates the residual impact of that uncertainty in financial terms. And we can develop the business case for collecting better data in the future. It's a very people-oriented process, structured thinking, but the key agenda is to develop quantitative, value-based decision-making. That's the Salvo process. There's a lot more to it than that, but I think it's much better that you hear that from the people who have been doing it from the course of the presentations. So, summary. Over the last 3 years, we've developed a methodology which is generic and applicable, and we've proven it in a wide range of industrial environments. We've tested against different maturities of audience and participants, and we are very confident indeed that this thing is applicable to these different circumstances. One of the big bonuses we've found is that if you ask the right people the right questions, we are finding that most organizations already have the knowledge they need to do this in a fully quantitative way. Yes, they've got mixed experiences of databases and history and asset health characteristics and recorded hard data, highly varied quality of that. But the combination of whatever they've got in hard evidence plus the right people in the room is enough to achieve a robust conclusion. That is the conclusion we've achieved. We've done over 30 case studies now, and they have typically identified at least £700,000 a year, that's about $1 million a year, net benefit compared to current practices. We've looked at water filter lives, pump renewals, treatment works, rail environment, process sector, manufacturing sectors, and we are finding significant systemic shift between our current practices, which is predominantly dominated by engineering judgment, through to a proper risk-based what-if style scenario exploration approach. The records currently land in the area of obsolescence management, where we are currently getting it wrong by a large degree, by our current practices of too little, too late, panic-based decisions. A proper consideration of the threat of obsolescence and the optimum degree of life extension through spare scavenging and renegotiated contracts with service providers and so on. You'll hear examples of that during the course of this afternoon. The bit that I think is most exciting of all about what we've done over the last 3 years is changing the atmosphere. Teaching technical people to talk the language of the finance director and the confidence with which to explain why something is needed and when, and being able to answer the question, real time, what happens if we don't do it? In risk terms, in resource terms, and economic terms. That really is changing relationships in organizations. We've had case after case of that, where people have come in straight into the process, and within a couple of hours, they get it. They understand how to articulate a business case. And I think that's probably one of the most proud aspects, I'd say, I'd like to share from the experience of Salvo. So, we set ourselves the agenda of developing the definition of how to go about this in a form that could then be explained and demonstrated, optimum way to manage aging assets. I'm confident enough to stand up and say, job done. However, please don't take my word for it. Over the next few presentations, you'll see what other people think about that same thing.